This talk is called From Bounties to Bureaucracy. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be going over a little bit of how the exploit marketplace works, different markets that you can play in if you're a bug hunter or an exploiter. We're also going to be talking a little bit about how actions taken by vendors in specific pieces of software affect the marketplace. There's not a lot of people who can actually talk about that, but because we've been in the marketplace for so long, we can show you historical data about how the market changes based off of various factors. And then we're going to talk about how bug bounty programs in general can stop the use of exploits by governments, which is always something that I'm really proud of when we're actually able to do that. So first, a quick introduction. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Brian Gorenc. I'm the Director of Vulnerability Research inside of Trend Micro Security Research Organization. And my primary responsibility is running the Zero-Day Initiative program. How many people have heard of the Zero-Day Initiative? Some people? Yeah? Sold us bugs before, hopefully. So we're the world's largest vendor-agnostic bug bounty program. And what does that mean? It means we work with researchers around the world. When you find a zero-day vulnerability, we will validate that vulnerability for you, and we'll pay you cash money for that vulnerability, and we will work to get them fixed. We're completely a defensive group, firmly in the white market, and I've been there for over 12 years, leading in vulnerability disclosure. I also organize and run the ever-popular Pwn hacking competition, where we bring researchers out from all over the world to attack the hardest pieces of software using zero-day vulnerabilities and bypasses to mitigations. I've also been involved in development for a very long time. Prior to being in the bug bounty world or in research world, I did development. So I've seen everything from requirements to development, unit tests, production, release, and now on the outside finding bugs and fixing bugs. So if we look, when you talk about the Zero-Day Initiative program and you talk about bug hunting, there's no really easy way to show that to people and understand the impact of that of what that means, right, and why that marketplace exists. So I kind of show it like this. So every one of those dots up there is a CVE, and we all know what a CVE is. But if you think about that, the Zero-Day Initiative program has been running for 12 years, and we've spent over $17 million US dollars on the exploit marketplace. So we've been involved basically since the beginning. And when you think about every dot up there being a CVE, that means a researcher out there in the world is actively looking at a piece of software, finds a zero-day, comes to us, we go through a financial transaction with them, we do a root cause analysis of this vulnerability, we supply it to the vendor goes and does their own root cause, they develop a patch, they release the patch, and it's deployed to end users. And if you think about the man hours that goes into every one of those bugs, over 5,000 CVEs since the beginning, that's a significant amount of work, right? And by looking at that, and I always say this to people when I'm talking about vulnerabilities, is there's a lot of zero-day vulnerabilities, but there's not a lot of zero-day exploits, right? People actually leveraging those vulnerabilities. But what we can do is look at that data and look at the trends that are happening in the zero-day vulnerability discovery market and map that to what's actually going to be used in the wild. Now, I get this question all the time, like, why would Trend Micro spend $17 million? And we always get asked, how is it possible that you can be only in the white market and not in the gray market, which we'll talk about later? It's really this, right? This is the value of the program for us. What we do is when we actually purchase that vulnerability information, we do a root cause and we deploy signatures and protections against that zero-day vulnerability, and that's how we provide value to the company. And that small investment, that small in relative terms, that's being made by the company actually has a huge significant impact on the attack surface and the ecosystem, and it also provides a lot of value to the customer. And so when you think about the program, the actual percentage that the company is spending on it is very small compared to what they can make off of just the intelligence and the protection that exists from the work that we do. Now, let's take a look at the exploit economy a little bit, so we all are on the same page. Now, before working with ZDI, or before running ZDI, I was a bug hunter. I would find vulnerabilities, I would disclose them to ZDI. And when you find a bug, you really have a couple of options, what you can do. First, you can either, what I call work in the white market, which is what we're trying to represent here. You sell the bug to ZDI, iDefense, or you sell it to the vendor, and they provide you a bounty for your discovery. And the whole idea here, or you work with a platform company like HackerOne or BugCrowd or HackIn or these different groups that exist, The whole purpose of this market is to fix the bug, right? And to provide defensive measures for the vulnerability itself. In this case, what we're really interested in is the bug, or the proof of concept. And I got actually asked this at dinner yesterday, was whether we needed an exploit to actually make this happen. Well, we don't in the white market, because all we care about is fixing the vulnerability in the end. And that's one place where you can work, is in this white market. Now, if you take that vulnerability and you turn it into an exploit, you can actually go work in the gray market. And that's what we're representing here. And the way that you can do that is you can work directly with the government and sell them the bug, or the exploit now, or you can work with a vulnerability broker, right? And this broker is going to kind of be a middleman between you and the government, right? And if you look at what's going on now with a lot of the hacking in the elections and et cetera, a lot of people are going through the vulnerability brokers because they don't want to be sanctioned when they get discovered, because eventually they do get discovered. But this is where the actual real money is in the gray market. You can see on the white hat side, we're spending anywhere from 3 figures to 6 figures on bugs, but mostly on the lower end. When you're working in the gray market, you can make anywhere up to $1 million, $2 million, just depending on the exploit. And this is the total package: the zero-day vulnerability, the exploit against the mitigation, and all of that stuff packaged together and being sold. But you don't know where that's going to be used, right? This is an ethical decision that you have to make as a researcher, whether you want to supply a government with a weapon. And there's obviously reasons for this to exist, right? Do you have an exploit to break into a terrorist cell so you understand what's going on, to take down pedophiles? But you never also know whether it's going to be used against your own citizens. And this is kind of that gray area. The other place you can work is the black market. In the black market, you're selling to people, it doesn't matter what the outcome is for you. You're trying to get as much money as possible. Typically, you're going to sell to an exploit kit creator. That exploit kit creator is going to compromise a bunch of machines, create a botnet out of it, rent out that botnet to people to do things like spam, DDoS, credential harvesting, things like that. That credential harvester is going to steal a bunch of credentials, sell them to a smart criminal who's going to buy a bunch of them. He's going to sell it to a dumb criminal who's going to use it to buy beer and chips. Now, in this equation, the dumb criminal typically gets caught. And the smart criminal and the spammer gets caught, obviously, because everybody hates spammers. And the smart criminal also gets caught. But when you look at the complete market, those are the really only people who are really at risk of being caught. So you look at the exploit kit creator, now just recently they started to be busted, but the people selling the exploits into the black market typically not being caught. Now, let's think about this for a minute. We know that there's 3 kind of markets you can work in, but how active is that economy? Now, how much has it grown over the last, say, 5 years? Well, we can take a look at the ZDI program and understand how active that actually is. So what you see here on the slides is what I call a submission rate into the program. So these are new bugs arriving into the program over a 5-year period, calculated basically by quarter. And if you look, it's grown pretty significantly. Back when I took over the program in 2013, we were receiving less than 100 0 days a quarter. There was really 2 guys working in the program at the time, myself and Jazel Spellman. And we were able to handle that kind of throughput. But quickly, the program grew in leaps and bounds. And if you look currently, second quarter 2018, we're receiving almost 1,000 0 days a quarter. That's a significant amount of bugs coming into our program that we can select from. Now, when I say we're vendor agnostic, what that means is a company is not paying us to run their bug bounty program. We are running a bug bounty program for the purposes of intelligence, and so we can pick the best 0 days out of that 900 a quarter that we get to provide protection from. And that's why we're so active in the Microsoft and Adobe advisories, because we can pick the best, right? And so our accept rate out of these 900 is typically around 50%, because we've built a community over time that knows what we're looking for. Now, out of that 900 in a quarter, we'll take a look at just the first half of this year. What types of bugs are we getting, right? What type of variety are we getting? And it's actually kind of interesting. It changed since 2 years ago. Right now, we're receiving about 35–40% of our bugs in high-profile software: Microsoft, Oracle, Adobe, all the big players, right? But the interesting thing here that we don't normally see is the amount of vulnerabilities in SCADA solutions that we're receiving into the program. Again, almost 40% of the bugs coming into ZDI are related to SCADA, most specifically against human-machine interface software that's used to interface with the actual PLCs and things like that. And what's happened is people over the years have taken their knowledge of Windows vulnerabilities and moved it over into the HMI, which was kind of an untapped surface, and they're able to do a lot of damage over there and find a lot of bugs, hundreds of bugs in HMI solutions. The other thing that's interesting is that now people are starting to look at virtualization software. That small sliver of virtualization software that exists in that pie chart is specifically related to software that's used to make the cloud, right? Things like VMware, things like Hyper-V, Oracle's VirtualBox solution. People have just started to look at these attack surfaces, and we did a presentation actually on this at OffensiveCon earlier in the year about how easy it is to break out of a virtual machine and execute code in the hypervisor or in the underlying host operating system. And it's actually really easy. Like a little bit of work related to how the communication happens back and forth between the guest and the host, and you can find a way out. Now, some of our top vendors, we're happily thankful that Adobe exists, because they keep supplying us with bugs that we can go buy. And Microsoft are kind of our long-time been number one and number two in our program. But now regional software vendors like Wecon, Advantech, and Cisco, who's actually sponsoring this conference, are also now supplying us a lot of bugs. And researchers are starting to look at that. Now, we talked about variety. Let's talk about where we're buying bugs from. So all the countries in blue are countries that we've actively purchased bugs from. And it's a worldwide market. Now, there's a couple countries up there that should be blue that aren't. One is Mexico. One of our top suppliers is actually out of Mexico City. And we just spoke at a conference down there and got to meet with him in person. And he's been supplying us bugs. He has over 1,000 submissions into the program, just this one individual. And he kind of lives off of our program. We're also starting to see a lot of stuff come out of Africa, where in the past, it was a lot of web vulnerabilities. We're starting to see memory corruption bugs come out of Africa, and even attacks against things like the baseband processor in your phone. If you follow our contest, which is actually a talk about later in the conference about the Android pwning, there is that complicated attack surface is now being looked at. And we're talking about one vulnerability being able to be used to compromise a baseband processor in a phone. There's no mitigations in place, so the exploitation techniques are relatively easy. All of that stuff coming out of Africa. Now, where do you think we're getting most of our high-profile vulnerabilities from? Like things like Microsoft, Adobe, et cetera. Can you just shout out some guesses? China, Russia, right? Most of those are coming from the United States, Canada, and from China. And that makes sense if you think about what those countries are using in their active attacks, right? The researchers in those regions know that the bugs are valuable for whatever governments that are in this space, and so that's where they're doing research. So I always find that really interesting. Like that's kind of validation, I think, of some of the stats that we're going to be talking about. Now, where do you think we're getting most of our SCADA vulnerabilities from? Critical infrastructure software. Anybody? Where? Germany? Any other guesses? Russia? Absolutely. Russia is our top supplier of SCADA vulnerabilities. And the way that it's working now is in the past, people would be submitting to the program, they would submit one bug, and it would be just a proof of concept that crashes the software. Now they're submitting 50, 60 bugs, all with white papers and exploits. This is a very different turn for us, right? Because people are submitting us in complete research projects, and they're really spending a lot of time understanding the attack surface, building exploit techniques that are useful against those, and then really doing a lot of damage across the board. And that's why we see, the 900 submissions in a quarter. Is people are getting really, really good at this type of research. Now, we've talked about kind of where things are coming from and the different bugs that we're seeing, and so what we want to do is we want to understand how the gray market works. And traditionally, we couldn't do that because it's called the gray market or the black market, and only if you knew the right people or you had the right connections would you be able to understand what that market actually looked like. Until recently, the hacking team breach occurred. And when the hacking team breach occurred, all their emails are dumped on WikiLeaks, and the entire industry at that time basically went through their complete email dumps and looked for the 0 days that they were using and worked with Microsoft and the other vendors to get them fixed. But we took a different approach in ZDI because we knew that the industry was going to do that. What we wanted to understand is what was the financial incentives for the researchers, who were they buying from, who were they selling to, what kind of software or services were they buying, how were they actually looking at buying vulnerabilities, and who did they talk to. But if we look at Hacking Team just as a business, you can see that they were making significant amount of money. These are just some invoices for the software that they were selling, the remote access Trojan, and these are just the support contracts. Right? These are 90,000 euros for support of the Trojan that they had, 180,000 euros, and it was being bought by a significant number of countries. Let's just read some off here. Guatemala, Lebanon, Mongolia, Russia, Egypt, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brazil, Bangladesh, South Korea, Cyprus, UAE, Mexico, Hungary, and a small company in Maryland called Cyberpoint, and there's another three-letter agency in Maryland. Who knows? Maybe they were buying it for them. I have no idea. But it was a very lucrative business for them. These are just support contracts. These aren't the actual initial purchases. You can imagine what those actually were. And what was interesting is they actually released their profit and loss spreadsheets, right? So from a business perspective, we can understand how good they were actually doing as a business and how that market was actually going, evolving. We can look from 2015 to 2016, they were expected to grow their business revenue-wise by 33%, which is great for a startup, right? I mean, obviously, like in the software space, you want exponential growth, but we're talking about, offensive security, right? This is not like, people buying this stuff off the shelf. These are very unique buys, right? Expected to grow 33% year over year. They had about 55 full-time employees, expected to grow to 67 in the previous year. But what's really interesting for us is this, the other personnel costs. This is what we would call contracting dollars, and where we think that they were using to buy zero-day vulnerabilities and things like that. And you can see that they were expecting to grow their other personnel costs pretty significantly in the next year, almost 50%. And they were more than likely using some of this money to go buy zero-day. So the question is, how is it possible to go buy zero-day on the gray market? Right? And how does that compare to us in the white market? Are we doing the right thing? We want to patch bugs, and we do that all the time. We've almost patched 1,200 bugs already in 2018. Are we making an impact in what's being used in the gray market, and are we competing in that space? That's what we want to know. So how do they go about buying zero-day? One way to do this is using consultancy services. Right, and this is what we do in the white market. Everybody who submits to our program is a consultant. We pay them a fee. They provide us intellectual property, and we make an exchange, right? That's how this works. So you can see they were doing something similar. You can see that they were paying somebody $40,000 for consultancy services. And the only reason we know that this is likely zero-day vulnerability exchange is because we know the researcher, right? This is a beneficiary on the list is Vitaly Toropov. He was a submitter, or he was a researcher, not very well known prior to the Hacking Team breach publicly, but he was very well known to ZDI because we had been buying bugs from him for a lot of years prior to this leak coming out. And he's very good, very, very good at finding zero-day and writing exploits. And what's unique about him is he exploits software in ways that aren't really publicly documented. So from an intelligence perspective, it's important for us to know what's not publicly documented, right? So we can build protections against it. But he was also selling, he kind of disappeared from our program, and then he showed up in the Hacking Team breach, right? So in this case, we had a researcher move over into the gray market, but they're using the same model that we are, right, for buying bugs using consultancy services. Now, another option is to use a vulnerability broker, right, to actually buy zero-day. And one of the interesting things about the breach was it actually leaked out, how they sold, or how a broker actually sells their bugs. And if you look at it, they sell it differently than the way we buy it in the white hat world. They actually use this thing called an exclusive purchase, a non-exclusive purchase, or a monthly license. you can buy it in different ways, right? And that's very interesting. And if you think about it, for a government to purchase a vulnerability, they're likely going to purchase it in an exclusive purchase because they want to use it one time. They want to throw it away immediately afterwards because they never want to be caught, right? And if you think about it, countries that spend $10 million on a missile don't mind investing $100,000 or whatever it's going to take to get the intelligence to know where to put that missile, right? So it's a very small investment for them to buy an exclusive purchase. Now, in the white market, when we buy a bug, we pay immediately. Or if you're a vendor, you pay after the patch comes out. So as part of our program, we try to pay as fast as possible. In the gray market, their payment schedules are a little bit different. You can see here that this is an exclusive purchase of at the time it was an Adobe Flash vulnerability for almost $100,000. And the way they pay is kind of staggered, right? So after 30 days, they're going to pay you 50%. After another 30 days, they're going to pay you another 25%. And after another 30 days, they're going to pay you the remaining 25%. The whole purpose of this pay schedule is to make sure that the zero-day maintains its zero-day status, right? Because what they don't want you to do is to sell the bug to them and immediately sell it to ZDI, where we're going to go get it fixed. All right, so they're going to stagger this payment out so that we know that it will maintain its zero-day status long enough to actually provide them value, right? And what's different about the gray market is they're actually going to target what they purchase, right? So when groups like Zerodium or these other groups say that they're interested in buying, an iOS jailbreak, that's because they have a buyer for an iOS jailbreak already lined up. So you can kind of get an understanding of what's actually happening in the marketplace by what they're advertising. Now, in a bounty program, we want to fix bugs. We want to have an impact on the gray market. And so at the time, we could only tell if we were having an impact on the gray market by looking at these leaks and actually examining their exploit inventory, which is shown here, and determining whether we are actually purchasing bugs in the software that they're selling bugs in, or they're basically selling exploits in. And you can see by the red arrows, ZDI had purchased vulnerabilities in all of these different softwares: McAfee Policy Orchestrator, Android, PHP, Firefox, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're doing a decent job mapping to what is being sold on the gray market, right? But we don't really understand if we're actually having an impact until some of the stories that we'll talk about later. Now, we know that that they're going to be using 0 days, and we want to understand, now we know what they're using in their attacks, how they're selling them. But what kind of market factors and trends occur that change what's available to the marketplace to use? And that's what we're going to examine now. So what we're going to look at is several case studies of submissions and some stories around why the submission rates changed. For basically every massive exploitation technique that's been talked about over the last 5 years. So what you see here is the submission rates into the program for Java sandbox escapes, right? So you can see normally anywhere from 1 to 10 is what we normally get. And all of a sudden in the third quarter of 2012, we received a massive spike, right? And we knew something was wrong at this time because everybody was using Java sandbox escapes. And admittedly, we got this spike a little bit late, right? Because we want to be able to predict the future. So we got this spike a little bit late, right? Submitters started to understand that Java sandbox escapes were a thing. They started submitting it to the program, and we would receive, basically, 30 in a quarter, which is a lot of bugs in Java at the time. It was kind of the first time I had experienced a spike like that in the submission rates. Now, not only do we see a spike in traffic, but then in the second quarter of 2013, we also see a significant drop in traffic, right? Why is this? Well, this is because this is the exact time the browser manufacturer said, we're done with this Java sandbox escape stuff and all this massive exploitation that's happening in the exploit kits, and we're going to integrate click-to-play, right? So every time you ran a Java applet, you had to click on it for it to actually work. And that really took away the mass compromise vector. That single action from the vendors significantly changed the marketplace and the number of bugs that were being discovered because they were no longer as useful anymore. Now, this is just one example. Now, another example in our program is this line here, which is the submission rate of Internet Explorer 0 days into the ZDI program. Now you can see, what is it, second quarter 2014, we were receiving almost a new IE 0 day, use after free typically, every single day, right? And we were analyzing this, and they were really easy to analyze because you just ran them with bang heap, they would immediately trigger, and they were all exploitable, every single one of them. Now, this time we were starting to receive a spike a little bit earlier than them being actively used in the wild, right? So now we're kind of getting ahead of the game here. But you also see that, again, a massive spike and a huge decrease at a point in time, specifically right here in the second quarter of 2014. Now, what happened here, and what most people don't understand because they weren't looking at UAFs with the same way we were, is that in the second quarter of 2014, Microsoft silently released a mitigation, specifically to stop UAFs from being exploitable. It's called Isolated Heap and Memory Protection, or MGC. And when that actually happened, it had a significant impact on the security of that browser. So much so that we had about 20 or 30 of these UAFs in our queue, and they all instantly died. They were all gone when they released that mitigation. And actually, Microsoft should take a lot of credit for this, but they don't, for some reason. But it was a really great mitigation that nobody really knew about. And you can see it had a huge impact on the submission rates in our program. Now, where did everybody go? They kind of stopped submitting at that point. That's because they started to move over to Edge, right, the new browser. And they started looking at that. And now what you're seeing is another spike here at the beginning of this year of submissions in Edge. And those are specifically around JavaScript optimization, because when everybody wants their JavaScript to run really fast, and when we get optimized JavaScript, it abandons a lot of security checks, which are actually able to trigger and cause remote code execution. And so people are starting to look at that as a new vector, and also finding different ways to trigger bugs. And this spike, we see, when are we going to start seeing these used in active attacks? And then all of a sudden, about a month ago, 360 found this bug being used in the wild, VB script, use after free, double free. And then Trend Micro found this bug being used in the wild, also a VB script vulnerability, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, when we see spikes in the program, now we're starting to link those to being used in active attacks, right? People are going to start using that. So what do we see here? This is the submission rate for Adobe Flash into the program. And you can see, yet again, another huge spike in the second quarter, third quarter of 2015, aligned with the massive use of Flash as the exploit vector of choice. And then when Adobe decided to end of life Flash, the submission stopped, right? That occurred second quarter 2017. And everybody went away, and they started looking elsewhere. And now we see another spike into the program for Adobe Flash bugs. And lo and behold, CVE 2018-5002 being discovered in the wild, being used and linked with an Office document. And that's now the new vector of choice. Now there's a new mitigation coming out that's going to stop that. So maybe that spike will go away. We'll see. But where are some bug classes that haven't been checked yet by the vendor? Haven't had a mitigation built for yet? What could you be looking for as a researcher that you're more than likely going to find bugs in? And that's what this line is, right? This is the submission rate of PDF reader vulnerabilities coming into the program. And you can see there has been no decline in this one yet. They haven't stopped looking at this yet. There's been no check by the vendor. And we actually have multiple people staffed on my team to look at PDF reader vulnerabilities right now. Now, you would expect, for a long time we saw this spike and we're like, well, when is it going to be used in the wild? Like, when is somebody actually going to use this? Because this is historically what we've seen, a spike and then it being used in the wild. And all of a sudden, several months ago, CVE 2018-4990 being actively used in the wild, now linking our ability to predict what's going to be used in the wild based off of the submissions in the program, are starting to bear fruit. We can actually see historically this pattern happen over and over and over again. Now, can we predict what's next? Now, if we lay all this submission data on top of each other, and we start laying in over the active exploitations, you get a really interesting idea of what's actually happening in the marketplace. Here we see a spike with Java 0 days. We see the correction by the browser manufacturers. We see everybody move over to Internet Explorer, basically right after that correction. the removal of the UAF as an exploit vector in IE in most cases, then moving over to Flash, and you see the spike there. The end of life of Flash come out, and now a massive spike in browser-related vulnerabilities, again due to JIT, and also to Adobe Reader and Foxit Reader and all these different PDF readers that everybody has installed on their workstations. Massive spike in that traffic now actively being used in the wild. So you can see, just by looking at this, we can kind of tell, like, you can see the researchers or the attackers moving from different pieces based off of the different modifications that the vendor makes in the software. And I always find this really, really interesting. Now, we're an open and free marketplace for the most part in bug hunting, but recently governments have decided that they want to stick their feet in the water, their toes in the water and try to regulate this space because they think they can do better than the industry itself. And that's where you see things like the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is actually a dual-use technology agreement between countries. And you can see that they actually added intrusion software into that list. So the transfer of intrusion software or exploits between countries in the Wassenaar Arrangement actually has to be monitored, and you have to get an export license for that. China, most people don't follow the Chinese market as close as I do, but China has also introduced, quote, regulations, which are just suggestions, to have them stop participating in things like contests or the transfer of exploits out of country, kind of bringing everything and keeping it inside of China. Right? So these regulations are actually bad for the industry, right? Because the open market that we had and the transfer of exploits, through the White Hat programs would actually provide vendors with enough information to build mitigations around that stuff. And it's had a significant impact on exploit research, specifically related to the contest that we run, Pwn to Own. If you look at Pwn to Own over its history, we're offering six-figure bounties on Chrome and Edge and VMware, all these different browsers and mobile phones and et cetera. And for a long time there was several years where the Chinese would come out and they would come out as teams and dominate this contest and bring exploits for every single target. And they would basically, there was two teams that were really good in China, 360 and Tencent, and they would actually fight each other to win the Master of Pwn, which is the actual award that we give out at the contest, so much so that they would actually reverse engineer the researchers, right, that were on the other team. So they would learn how that researcher was researching, find the bugs before they would find it, submit them to the vendor, kill those bugs so that they wouldn't win the contest. No joke, this actually happened. So it was actually that competition existed, but now no longer exists due to regulations, what I think is very, very sad. Now, we know that we can patch bugs. We see that it has an impact in the gray market, at least we think it does, because we're kind of hitting the same code bases that they're looking at. We see the vendors making different adjustments in their software, and you can see the submission rates changing. But do we actually make an impact in what's actively being used by governments? That's what we really want to know. Are we actually solving this problem? Well, again, this is not something we can figure out until the leaks occur, right? WikiLeaks or these other different areas where exploit techniques come out. Because right now we're living in a shadow broker's reality, right? When you look at shadow brokers, what happened when they released the supposed NSA toolkit, we can understand by looking at the bugs that they were using whether we're actually making an impact in those. And there was actually a case here where we did make an impact, at least in the U.S. government's operations of, let's go back, U.S. government's use of exploits. Now, in our program in 2014, we received a vulnerability report that we kind of couldn't believe, right? So if you look back at Stuxnet, the initial vector for Stuxnet was a USB, right? You plug the USB in, you view the folder, and it installs the malware because there was a bug in the way that LNKs worked. And this was the most famous bug at the time. Everybody looked at that code base. It was extremely interesting. And we received a report in 2014 from a researcher, his first report, full white paper, full exploit of a bypass for that patch. And we couldn't believe it. How is it possible that the entire industry missed this edge case? Everybody in their research teams was looking at this, and we missed it. And all of a sudden, somebody out of Germany comes in and submits this bug to us that looks like this. Just view a folder and pops calc, right? That's not supposed to happen, obviously. What we learned is that Microsoft missed a single edge case in this patch that this person was able to actually figure out and leverage and write an exploit for. Again, it's very strange, though, for us because it was a white paper, full exploit, first-time submitter, not very normal for us. So we gave it to, we purchased it, we gave it to Microsoft, and we said, we were at HP at the time, you should really put out silent signatures for this bug because something's strange. But they never got back to us. And then Vault 7 happened, and we found out that that bug was actually being used by the supposed CIA closed network infiltration tool called Easy Cheese. And we were able to patch that bug and kill that bug, and it forced them to generate a new tool called Brutal Kangaroo. And it was, again, used for closed network infiltration. We had signatures for that bug, and we actually did get hits on that one in the wild. Now, it's not just the US government. Supposedly, the Russians are behind the Black Energy malware, according to ICS CERT at least. And that malware was actually leveraging some of those HMI vulnerabilities that we had been talking about earlier. And ZDI has actually killed numerous bugs in Black Energy, specifically related to Simplicity and also Advantech, through submissions from the program, actually from Russia. So at this point, we know we've had an impact in the United States. We know we've had an impact in the Black Energy malware. But do we have an impact in what's going on in possibly, Asia? Well, if we look back and we talked about the spike in browser traffic that we had seen CVE 2018-8174 being used in active attacks as part of a Word document, and it was leveraging this code right here. This is the proof of concept for a double free. This one was found by 360. You can see what it looks like. There's a class terminate. They're doing some resetting. They cause a use after free condition. In our program, in that spike, this is what we're seeing. Other submissions coming in, looking very similar to the bug that is going to be actively used in the wild, right? Here's just 4 or 3 additional bugs that we've actually received into the program, and we have, I think, several more open purchases that we've made in VB script vulnerabilities, that look very, very similar to this. And so we can take this information and actually build protections around it, which is very valuable for us. The use of class terminate is a way to actually trigger some of these use after free conditions, and we're starting to see that trend come in. Now, Trend Micro found in the wild CVE 2018-8373 that looks like this. Another VB script vulnerability, this time using class initialize, just a little bit different vector, but still very similar to what's actively being used in the wild. This matches our trending data. So what do we know right now? We know that the power of the white market can have an impact on what's actively going to be used up by the governments. We can understand from a trending perspective what it's going to look like so we can build protections for it and actually get them fixed. And so that, for us, is extremely valuable, right? And that's why we run the program the way we do. So to conclude, blockchain solves everything. Actually, that's a lie. And I was actually at a blockchain conference last week, and I used that line. It was hilarious to me. So they didn't like it. So bounty programs impact everybody, right? And what I love about the marketplace is, it doesn't really matter where and which program you're going through. You're going through ZDI, you're going through the vendor, you're going through the platform companies like HackerOne and BugCrowd. In the end, all of that work and all of those submissions are going to help protect the ecosystem, right? And we're using that money for a good thing. It guides research, it improves security patching, and even if you're not involved in the marketplace, you're impacting the greater ecosystem, which I always find really, really valuable and something that I'm really proud of. But the marketplace is very crowded, and it's always shifting, right? So as a runner of one of these programs, we have to be monitoring what's going on in the gray market. We need to understand what's happening in the platform companies to make adjustments to make our program attractive to everybody. And it's really fun to actually participate in that and make the white market a sexy alternative to the gray and black market. We can use this data to actually predict the future of exploits. We can see the trends occurring over many, many years of what's actively going to be used, because the reality is there's not a lot of zero-day exploits, but there's a ton of zero-day vulnerabilities. And we can take those zero-day vulnerabilities and understand what's going to be exploited in the wild shortly. But bug bounty programs aren't the only thing out there, right? They're not the panacea, as they say. it's cheaper not to ship the bugs. And what we hope to see actually in the future is that there's a lot more investment in secure development, right? But we don't see that a lot outside of the major vendors of Google and Microsoft. I can tell you now, looking at the SCADA manufacturers, there's literally no mitigations in that software. A lot of that code is built very, very quickly without a lot of mitigations and a lot of security checks. And still, as an industry, we need to do a lot to make sure that we're kind of forcing developers to kind of take this secure approach about development. And with that, thank you for having me for the day two. If you're interested in what we do at ZDI, this is kind of our blogs and our Twitter accounts. If you want to communicate with us privately, you can do that. And at that point, I'll be around if anybody wants to ask any questions about the marketplace. Thanks for spending your time with me this morning, and I will slowly get off the stage. Thank you.